What I've discovered is that attachment is really not just about your romantic relationship. It's also about your friendships, your collegial relationships, the way that you attack your life and all your goals in personal and academic and occupational settings, and just in general, how you feel about yourself. Do you feel generally that you're satisfied with what's going on? And that doesn't mean that everything's perfect. No one's gonna have a 10 out of 10 on every major domain of their life. But do you generally feel like when you wake up, you're excited, you're looking forward to something in your life?
In intimate relationships, it seems kind of more obvious, like, okay, we need to have the hard conversation. With friendships and maybe even professional relationships, we kind of let a lot more slide.
Yes.
Would you agree, and why?
Totally agree. And I think it's because a way to reinforce any negative
Like, I knew
beliefs you
this was going to happen.
Exactly.
I knew you were going to leave me. I knew this was going to be difficult.
Yes.
So it's like negative manifestation. How can we maybe begin to understand that maybe a lot of the issues, the friction, our needs not being met, the wounds not being healed is on us?
Hey, this is Dr. Judy Ho, licensed clinical and forensic neuropsychologist and author of The New Rules of Attachment. Welcome to Ever Forward Radio.
Well, Dr. Judy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Chase. It's awesome to be with you. Love your podcast and love what you're doing.
How do you define attachment as it pertains to both interpersonal and intimate relationships?
Yeah, so attachment is that first unique and crucial bond as human beings that we all need as social species, where it's really your template of understanding who you are and the way you're going to relate to others, and also what kind of outcomes you can expect in your life. And it really ties to your first primary caregiver or caregivers and the quality of that relating to you that helps you to understand all of these things.
And so I understand that a lot of your work centers around, quote, how to heal your relationship. How do we know if our relationship actually needs work? Beyond kind of the obvious cues, you know, I'm not feeling heard, I'm not feeling loved, we're struggling with some very obvious things. How do we objectively kind of look at our relationship and go, you know what, I need to work on this?
Yeah, so, attachment, it's interesting because most of the focus on attachment, especially in pop media, has been this crucial bond that you have as a baby, as an infant, as a child with usually your parents or some other important adult. That's the template for all your other relationships, but mostly the emphasis has been on romantic relationships.
Right.
So if you feel like something is lacking in terms of connection, or you're feeling like you're anxious in your relationship, or maybe when you connect, you also feel stressed out by it and want to go away, people are still mostly talking about attachment in terms of a romantic bond. But what I've discovered is that attachment is really not just about your romantic relationship. It's also about your friendships, your collegial relationships, the way that you attack your life and all your goals in personal and academic and occupational settings, and just in general, how you feel about yourself. So back to your question about when you know that needs healing, it's an awesome question. And I think that mostly it's just when you look at your life, do you feel generally that you're satisfied with what's going on? And that doesn't mean that everything's perfect. No one's going to have a 10 out of 10 on every major domain of their life. But do you generally feel like when you wake up, you're excited, you're looking forward to something in your life? There's something that you're just anticipating with something that's more of a positive energy rather than anxiety or trepidation or, I just don't want to get through another day. That's what I hear a lot from the people that I work with. And I don't want anybody to live like that. You want to wake up and say, okay, there's some things I don't want to do, but there's something that I'm excited to do. Yeah.
Why do you think that in some instances it is easier for us to confront the other person in the relationship, whereas, in maybe friendships, I feel like it's, I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of like word vomiting a little bit in my own relationships, but in intimate relationships, it seems kind of more obvious, like, okay, we need to have the hard conversation. With friendships and maybe even professional relationships, we kind of let a lot more slide.
Yes.
Would you agree, and why?
Totally agree. And I think it's because of that intimate bond, as you just mentioned. In your intimate relationships, it's where hopefully a lot of people can derive some of the deepest connections in their lives, but also it's where you're the most vulnerable because you might let your guard down more, and then you're wondering, is everyone going to be okay with that? Am I going to be accepted? Am I still going to be loved after this argument we have, or after I tell them that I've had this wound from before, or trauma or baggage that I'm carrying around? Whereas with your friendships and your collegial relationships, there's a lot that you can hide behind, right? Because you can kind of dip in and out of friendships if you wanted to. And especially given the pandemic, it's very easy to do
yeah.
that. Like, hey guys, so sorry, whatever. Like there's always an excuse to be made where
Yeah.
you haven't connected with people. And you can kind of jump in, get a little dose of it, show them your best self, and then like get away, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with your work relationships, because again, they're only seeing you in one sphere of life. And a lot of times people are killing it at work, but it's really when they go home and how they are with their families and their romantic partners where, okay, the irritability is coming out or whatever self-doubt.
Kind of save that for that,
Right.
that place.
Exactly. And I think that most of us, again, you just can't keep up that facade everywhere. At some point, you're going to have to let some of that out.
Yeah.
And it tends to happen with the people that are closest to you because, there's that place where you can maybe let your guard down just a little bit. But then you're questioning, was that okay?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah.
How would you advise somebody, let's say they feel like they need to have a hard conversation or their needs aren't being met in an intimate relationship, their partner, professional relationship, coworker, we'll say, and friend, like really good friend. Would you advise somebody to approach those conversations the same way, or do they need to be going about them in a different way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that just in general, it's really hard sometimes to approach people authentically.
Why?
And to really express your needs. Yeah. And I think the reason is people are always questioning, one, whether once they express those needs, that person is still going to care about them the same way, or if their perception of you is going to change. Like if you ask for something like, oh, they're afraid that maybe now they're going to think I'm needy, or now they're seeing a weakness of mine, right? And I think it applies actually to all your relationships, not necessarily just your intimate ones. I think it's really just about people being able to show up and say, this is what I want and what I need, and that it's okay to have them. And for different reasons, we learn oftentimes in earlier experiences, and especially in our childhood, whether it's okay to ask for those things.
Right.
And if you're going to get met with...
We're kind of preconditioned.
Yeah, exactly. And also if you're actually going to get your needs met. So sometimes you express your needs as a child and they don't get met. So that teaches your brain something of, oh, well, why bother? If I can't rely on anybody, I'll just do everything myself. Like that's one type of attachment style. And then another person might say, well, I only get my needs met if I cry and I whine and make like a huge deal about it as a child. So then an adult, they kind of find a different manifestation of that where it's like, I need that attention, even if it's negative attention.
I got to bring the drama.
Right. But at some point, then they'll hear me.
Right.
Right. And it's this is coping. This is not to fault anybody for the way that maybe they approach these things. If you hear yourself in one of these examples, it's more just that early on when we learn these things, our brain locks it in differently than when you learn something as an adult. Because when you learn something as an adult, it's one event. When you learn something as a child, you're just soaking up everything about what's going on to learn how the world works. And so those lessons tend to stick a lot. They're just a lot more sticky than other lessons that you may learn as an adult.
Do you think in relationships we're coming to the table more in like a hindrance manner, things from our past that are hindering our present and therefore the future of the relationship? Or do you think people more so get stuck in the future of the relationship of, is this going to last? Are they going to still be my friend? Are we still going to be lovers, married, all of this? Is it more of a past or a future kind of fear and a hindrance to making relationships really bloom?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really about the future. It's that future orientation that drives anxiety. So what you're talking about is that anticipatory anxiety of, okay, the worst case scenario is going to happen. And meanwhile, you're not attending to what's going on in front of you. And then sometimes that leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy where then the relationship does dissolve. And then you use that fact as a way to reinforce any negative
Like, I knew
beliefs you already
this was
have.
going to happen.
Exactly.
I knew you were going to leave me. I knew this was going to be difficult.
Yes.
So it's like negative manifestation.
Yeah, totally.
way.
I mean, yes, absolutely. And I think that the problem, for a lot of people, of course, they don't always realize that they're doing that. But I think a lot of the focus and why this happens is because you're trying to anticipate bad things in the future so you can be prepared. So it comes from like a survivalist
We don't want to be
place.
caught off guard.
Exactly. So some of the highest performing people I've ever worked with have like the most anxiety, but for a long time in their life,
That's reassuring. All right, we're good. All right.
But for a long time, I feel like they like made it work for them. It's like, okay, I'm using that to motivate myself. But I think at some point it can go off to a different place. And at that point, you're having more struggles and more difficulty because you're really starting to spend so much time catastrophizing about your future that you're not even able to lay that foundation of what's going on in front of you. And I think a big problem of why that happens and why this is such a big issue is that we have crazy selective memory as human beings. We basically pick up what we want to pick up in terms of what's going on, and then we reinforce whatever beliefs we have. And I think what's shocking to people is that, our brains are cognitive misers. So we actually have an easier time making room for information that already reinforces something we already think or believe, even if it's negative. And it's harder for us to actually say, oh, this new information might mean that I have to change my pre-existing ideas. That's a much more manual shift. It's like you have to really
that takes work.
Consciously
that takes energy,
work on
yeah.
it. Exactly. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is, do we really struggle with just being present, being here and now in any and all relationships to make them work?
I think it's a conscious effort that we all have to make. And maybe some people have an easier time than others, but I think it's a struggle nevertheless, just for the human brain, just the way that we're conditioned. Our brains have inner monologue. It's what allowed our species to succeed and be at the top of the food chain. But that inner monologue is constantly going in different places, right? It's like imagination and creativity. That's where it all comes from. But at the same time, your mind wanders a lot. So it's very hard just to say, oh, this is what's happening right now, and I should be putting my full attention to it. Yeah.
What do you think is the difference between a need and a wound as it relates to our relationships?
Yeah. So I think a need is something that I really believe is fundamental. It's things that we have to have. And sometimes they have a survivalist.
Like our non-negotiables, would you say?
Almost like a non-negotiable, although some people, they deny their own needs or they say it's not important, and then they don't feel right. They're off center, and it's because they're denying that this is actually a need for them.
And then it probably kind of comes up in a not so pleasant way down the road.
Exactly.
You realize, no, that was a need, not a want.
Right, right. And I think we kind of talk ourselves sometimes out of our needs. But, there's needs that are fundamental and probably universal to all of us. Like we all need food to survive. We need shelter. We need some form of socialization. That is just like basic human understanding as a social species. And then I think needs can then vary among individuals, right? There's some higher level needs of like, okay, I need this type of independence even when I'm in a romantic relationship. But that's a need for me. That's not a want. For me to feel successful in this relationship and feel bonded, I need my alone time. That is a need for me, right? So those can vary among individuals. But wounds are things that happen in the past, right? Most of the times they're things that have happened in the past. But it's almost like they haven't fully healed, and then different triggers, it's almost like picking at the wound. So then like it reopens.
Right. I thought I was over that. I thought I had healed from that.
Right.
I thought I found the person that would never bring this back up, but here I am.
Exactly. And here I am. And like sometimes you think, as you were mentioning, like we're all good. But sometimes the situation happens and that's when you realize, oh wow, it was still here. It never healed. And actually the connection between wound and need, which was again such a great question, because there actually is a connection, which is that a lot of times your unhealed wounds come from denying your needs. So if you don't resolve or don't cop to the fact that this is a need for me, no matter what it looks like, no matter if people think that this looks selfish or like whatever I think people might think of my needs, if I deny myself that could essentially be a trigger for a wound that wasn't healed, because you may have certain needs that developed out of bad experiences.
Great
and you're
point.
like, well, now I know
Great
this
point.
is my boundary, but then you don't hold it, you don't ask for it, and it causes problems.
Let's say the person listening is kind of in that boat. We're realizing now, maybe as you're describing it, that this thing that is an issue in a relationship that I have is not really an issue with this relationship. It's something that I'm realizing is kind of a wound that wasn't quite done healing, and I still need to work on it. Can we work on the wounds of past relationships while still actively being in a current one?
You can. And I think it does take a lot of compassion for yourself, because you're going to get triggered and you're going to do things that you wish you didn't do to this person who is relatively innocent. And they're like, what happened? Why did
I'm
you
just trying to love you, man.
Yeah, right? Like, why?
I'm just trying to be a friend.
Exactly. What's going on over here? So you have to have some compassion for yourself that there's going to be missteps. You might overreact. That's like another great way just to know that maybe this is an old wound, that you overreact to a situation. Like, okay, it's a stressful situation, but like, did you have to yell about it, or did you have to get that angry? You know?
Okay, I want to ask you right there.
Yeah.
Overreaction are usually in the eye of the person receiving it. They're the wrong end of, you know, that receiving stick.
Yeah.
How can we fairly assess an overreaction and be honest with ourselves, or hear that feedback and try to reverse engineer it back to the root problem here?
Yeah, it can be hard because obviously our first instinct probably is to defend and to self-defend. And the self-justification process for humans is huge. Like there's always a way to explain all your behaviors.
We can justify everything, especially in a relationship.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. But if you slow down and you listen to the other person and you really participate in what I call active listening, this is like a very well-known therapeutic strategy that is actually a great relational tool for everyone. Essentially, it's just listening without judgment or trying to think about what you're going to say next. We all kind of do that though. Like when we're talking to someone, we're like, "Ooh, I know I'm going to say,"
especially as a
this.
podcaster,
right? You're like, I'm going to say this. I'm going to ask this question. But if you listen just without any expectation or any thinking of what I'm going to say next, then you really hear the person for their message. Like it's just to listen, to understand, and trusting yourself that like the next thing that you're going to say is going to come from an authentic, mindful place. It's very hard to practice. I try to practice it every day, and I still have days where I'm like, well, that was definitely not an active listening. So, you know, we all
I'm so
have to
busy
try
thinking to listen actively that I didn't hear anything that they said.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we all have to practice it. But if you can listen from an active listening place, then it kind of takes off the defenses. And then, of course, if you care about the person in front of you, then hopefully you can try to put yourself in their shoes. Like, wow, if somebody did that to me or said that to me, you know, how would I truly feel about that? Like, would I really be okay? Would I really think that was an overreaction, or would I actually think that that was a little bit overblown? And then I guess from there, you have to really think and say, what was I thinking in my mind just before I did this supposed overreaction? Maybe you still don't agree with it, but you're like, fine, I'll self-reflect. This hurt the other person, even if I think it was fine. So let me just try to think, take myself back, rewind the tape, and ask myself, what was I thinking just before this activity, this action happened? And what you'll notice is that most of the times there's an interpretation of something that caused any action, but sometimes we don't recognize
the thing
that.
is very rarely ever the thing.
Exactly.
It's everything leading right up to it. The environment, what you were saying, what you were thinking, how you were feeling. Yeah. So true. So
exactly. I mean, it feels kind of like the game of telephone where, you know, it's the same sentence, but like three different people will hear it three different ways and react in three different ways. And so it is important just to like check that and say, well, what was I thinking right before that? And then I think if you start to do that regularly, you'll start to notice a pattern to your thinking. And then you'll notice, oh, wow, anytime that anyone like seems to question my ability to X, like this is when I have these overreactions. Or anytime anyone insinuates that I don't have any independence, that I'm always relying on other people, that's when I really get upset. It's like, well, okay, then that's where the overreaction, that's the root.
I want to talk about that, but first I want to say one thing to kind of wrap up this last little section. One thing that's really helped me in these circumstances, beyond just really trying to be more present in, you know, conversation with my wife, whether it's a fun conversation or a tough one, friends, colleagues, whatever, is I have tried to get myself to cue myself to go, what if they're right? When I'm hearing something that immediately puts my guard up, I know or I have a past tendency to kind of overreact, or it's just anything other than, oh my God, yes, absolutely, I agree. I try to just go, what if they're right? What if they're right? And I think that really does help me drop in to be more present. It definitely helps me separate a little bit more from overreaction, from egotistical response. And it really, I think it's a great practice for anybody to get in the habit of. Would you agree?
I love that practice. It's this idea of like, I mean, in so many ways, it's almost like devil's advocate with your own mind.
Exactly.
Because your first reaction, right, is like, no, they're wrong. And it's like, but what if they're right?
What if?
And what would that mean? You know, I think that's a great follow-up for all of us to ask. And it's hard, right? It's hard to kind of ditch your ego in the moment. So like, how have you dealt with that? Because I think that's probably a huge question a lot of people have about just like, how do you ditch your ego to even get to really reflect on that question?
Yeah, I think a great go-to is just whenever you are not in 100% agreement with whatever the other person is saying, is just entertain the idea of what if they're right. And that will change everything. That will change how your body language, that will change how you are present, change how you absorb, retain, how you respond, everything.
I love that. Yeah. No, you're so right too about just your body language. They're like geared up to like
Oh,
argue back.
Yeah.
Versus like, oh, if they're right, like, oh, I guess I could be more relaxed because it's not like I have to argue anything.
And how much,
Yeah.
how many of our arguments and the intensity is probably just fueled by poor body language or non-receptive body language. That probably just adds fuel to the fire.
Oh, totally. Those like para language cues where you think that you're not saying anything with your body language,
but you're saying,
but you are
everything.
Or just even like the way that your eyes are diverting from the person, like and then that person, if they have a wound, it's like that's triggering them, like not being listened to.
Yeah.
But you're like, I literally didn't open my mouth. And still you're not recognizing that you still played a role. But yeah, interpersonal dynamics are so tricky. They're so complex and it's so important. I love that tip. I think that's so great. I'm going to definitely teach that to my clients because that's amazing. And I think it just lessens like you said, the intensity of whatever you were going to go at them with. If you're like, you're wrong. Like, you know, that energy is different from what if they're right. You're not saying they're right for sure.
Right.
You're just saying, what if?
Yeah. It works for me at least.
I love it.
Take it. Run with it.
It's very good. Thank you.
You brought up something when we were done talking about that point about how you were bringing up us a lot. And it reminds me of this concept that I actually picked up from my wife. She's a lot of our friends and people go to her for relationship advice. She's one of the most non-judgmental and objective people I've ever met. And she has this kind of harsh truth for a lot of people to hear that I've heard from her as well sometimes. And it's, you're the common denominator. A lot of us in relationships, intimate, collegiate, professional, friends, we come to people for advice. I'm sure you get this a lot. And you begin to notice a pattern. It's like, they never do this, they never do that. And it doesn't matter who they are. It's always the same thing. But when she goes, you're the common denominator, how does that land with you? How can we maybe begin to understand that maybe a lot of the issues, the friction, our needs not being met, the wounds not being healed is on us?
Yeah, well, I love that saying and I love that question, or the statement rather, because it's not really about blaming you. It's not like you're the common denominator, like it's your fault.
It's not fault, right?
That's not fault.
Yeah.
It's more just you're the common denominator, so that allows you the room to self-reflect on how you can change. And it also then encourages change because it instills that belief that you can do something. Like if you're the common denominator, that also means that if you change something, you can change the equation.
Right. You're complaining about this problem. The problem never gets solved. Here's a potential solution to the problem.
Right. I love that because I think oftentimes, and sometimes totally understandable why this would happen. Like you do blame other people for things that have happened. And sometimes, like, you know what? It was kind of their fault.
Sometimes
at least
they
in
suck.
part. Yeah, sometimes people suck. But when we get into that cycle of others blaming, then it takes the onus off of us to change something, right? So what your wife says, which I love, it puts the onus back on you, not in a way of blame, but more of a place of action. Like, okay, if you're the common denominator, then change the equation. How might you change the equation? What are the things that you can do to make this better for you?
Well, Dr. Judy agrees with her. There's no living with her now.
I know,
that's for sure.
I know. We'll just like put that clip together and just send it straight to her phone.
All right, so I got a couple of questions from my audience that I want to ask. I thought this would be a really unique experience. So
Fun.
I'm just going to read this straight up. No names. Everybody anonymous here. Yeah. So this actually comes from someone who is a health and fitness coach. And she says that I see this a lot with my clients and own relationship history. I'm not / they're not the one doing the sabotaging, but how do you recognize when it's time to lean in to support your partner who seems to be trying to self-sabotage your relationship versus knowing when to walk away?
Wow, that's so hard because I know that for so many people out there, and certainly your listeners, they're probably pretty empathetic, attuned people. That's why they're subscribed to your podcast.
I believe so.
So I think that there's always that feeling of wanting to help others and having that empathy. But at some point, if the person is insistent on not helping themselves, it's different if they're saying, I'm trying to help myself, but I keep making these mistakes. Please work with me. And you see that they're really trying, number one, and that they're improving. But at some point, the walk away and that line is really, are we just in the same cycle over and over again? And there's really no moving forward. I mean, like moving forward 2 steps and then maybe every once in a while taking 1 step back. That's normal.
That's
Everybody
normal
should expect that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, like I should just give up. It's
Yeah.
like, well, like that's what I see in my clients all the time. They're making this progress and they come back and like, whoops, I blew something up. It's like, all right. But then they learn from it and then we keep going, right? I think that if you find yourself kind of having Groundhog Day though, where it's like revisiting the same issues over and over again, like always having to reassure them, even though you've already reassured them plenty of times. Sometimes people will set up tests. Again, it's not always conscious.
What
It's
would that
coming
look like?
from their wounds. Maybe like tests to make sure that you still care about them. So sometimes they might, on purpose flirt with somebody in front of you just to see if you have a reaction, or maybe they'll pick a fight just so that you do something grand to get them back, to get them back, to get yourself back in their good graces.
Would that still be kind of in the family of self-sabotage?
I think so, because it's more like even though you've told me you love me and we've had these conversations, I'm still setting up tests.
I still got to check it.
Yeah, I still have to check it and make sure that you're still here, even though obviously you're still here.
Right. So that's not a them thing. That's an us thing. That it kind of goes back to the common denominator maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that self-sabotage and how that is self-sabotage is, of course, then this relationship is probably headed to a bad place, whether it's just a bad relationship that you stay in or you leave. And then the person who set up these tests, now they can say, aha, see, I knew you were going to leave. Knew you didn't really love me. Knew it. Just took time to show your real, and that's what's so hard about just our brains, again, playing these tricks on us where we just selectively pick at the memories that just reinforces these terrible ideas that we have.
That kind of comes back to like just, I think, human nature, right? And this may be where I want to tap into your neuropsychologist, expertise is, aren't we all just day to day in a relationship or out of a relationship? We're just looking for the easiest path. We're looking for closed loops, or our brain is trying to close loops. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to just go, oh, if then, if then, if then. So what is going on? Maybe if you can talk to us about the brain, like if here's a better way to ask this question. What benefit does better understanding how our brain operates, what benefit does that have for our relationships?
Well, I think it gives you a huge window for forgiving yourself for your mistakes and not beating yourself up for past experiences that you might have had, or even dictating the future you could have. I mean, I think a lot of times if you don't understand really how your brain works, you don't realize that, oh, these missteps are universal. It's not just me, that I would sometimes self-sabotage or that I would sometimes set up tests for my loved ones, or that I would overreact and get my loved one to really, have a hard time dealing with me. We all do it to some degree, and it all goes back to a sense of survival. When you have that attachment relationship with your core caregiver, it was about survival then. And it's always about survival to some degree because, we need to be able to survive and thrive. But in common day, I mean, we're not running from saber-toothed tigers anymore. Things that really are linked to our survival is actually emotional and psychological survival, but they have the same effect on our brains and on our bodies. And so again, just knowing that, oh, you know what? I did this as a form of self-protection. Like it wasn't to be mean to somebody, or it wasn't that like, I really can't move forward. It was
a lot of
way
grace in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think if people can give themselves that understanding and grace, and, then that would help a lot. Just understanding that all of our brains work that way, and it's all based in and rooted in like a need to protect ourselves.
Now, everybody, don't go blaming all your relationship problems on your brain. Okay, This isn't a scapegoat, but I've always found power, and the more I can understand the human experience and kind of separate how I'm choosing to live my life compared to how life just kind of happens. How this human experience, what is going on physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and then really choosing to take my power back in each of those. It's not a scapegoat. No. It's just better understanding.
Right. Yeah. And then also knowing that you can tackle like one at a time. You don't have to fix everything at once, right? And that's really good too, because sometimes people just get overwhelmed by thinking, well, now this whole thing is a mess and I can't recover. It's like you just need to take the first step.
One more question from the audience here.
Cool.
How do I get my friend who keeps chasing guys who don't like her to see the light?
Such a good one. This reminds me of course, I feel like everyone's had that experience, either yourself or a friend. But this reminds me of that whole, the book and the movie that he's just not that into you. But you keep, again, the self-justification of like, oh,
you got to become undelusional first.
Right?
You know?
I know. Well, it's just like, well, like maybe they're just wounded and I can rescue them. And, you know,
I
sometimes
can fix them.
Right. And sometimes it's coming from a good place. Like one, you really like fixing people. And two, it gives you higher self-esteem. Like if you were to fix them, you'd feel amazing about yourself, but usually you can't fix them and then you feel bad about yourself. So I think that it's important just to ask this friend, you know, what do you really value? You know, what do you really value just both in yourself and also in a quality relationship? I feel like people get really caught up in chasing or like this goal of I'm going to fix this person that they don't even check their own values anymore.
It's more like the thrill of the hunt, thrill of the seek, the thrill of the fix.
Yeah, exactly. But really, when you think about what is a quality relationship to me, would it involve this? Would it involve, you know, having a nice date with somebody and then not hearing from them for 3 weeks? Like that's probably
the
not
answer
the
here
view.
objectively is no, people.
Yeah, right? So I always ask people like the miracle question. The miracle question is like when you're faced with a problem, like let's say you woke up this next morning and everything was magically fixed. What would your life actually look like? And actually paint a really vivid picture. And if you ask somebody that question, and if you ask this friend that question, I doubt that the picture they would paint is I woke up and I was still being ignored half the time and he was still not calling me back.
And I was just chasing him down, leaving messages and texts and DMs and all the things. And you're like, they're going to get back to me for sure.
Exactly. And then it's about then creating that cognitive dissonance of like, here's what you say you value and you want. And here's what the reality is. Like, how does that sit with you? And it sounds like a silly question to ask, but really like instead of answering the question for your friend, you should make them answer it. Because if you answer it for them, you're in that defense mode again. Well, you don't know him, right? But if you ask them, well, now that you see this dichotomy, what do you think about it? It puts them in the driver's seat again. They're the common denominator. They got to figure it out.
I love that.
Yeah.
One more here.
Okay.
How do you engage in radical acceptance in a partner who definitely isn't going to change?
Wow, that's hard.
Man, they're not making it easy for you.
I know, right? These are amazing questions. You have some great listeners. You know what? I feel like, of course, we have to check again, is this a need and is this a deal breaker in the relationship? But if they're not changing on something that's fundamentally just not okay with you, then that's a different conversation. But if we're talking about two human beings coming together and like, we'd love to change people, but you know what? Sometimes they're not going to. You come as you are.
Why do we love to sorry to interrupt you there, but why do we love to change people?
I think it's because we're looking for confirmation. Because oftentimes we want to change them to something that feels more consistent with ourselves, maybe certain parts of our own personality. Maybe we don't like something that they're showing that feels like a weakness to you. It's all about your self-perception. So if you can change them, then you can live in that validation space, right? Like, oh, my ideas were right in the first place. But it's just incredible. I mean, we have so much diversity in the human condition, and it's just impossible to just find somebody who's just 100% like you. And honestly, I don't really want somebody to be like a carbon copy of me. So I think if it's not like a deal breaker and you're just saying, man, this thing that this person does really annoys me, and I've told them that it annoys me, but they're still like that, and it's just driving me up the wall, but it's not a deal breaker. I think the radical acceptance is to really think about what you truly cherish about them. So it's taking
and it sounds like knowing
turn.
Your limits.
Yeah, knowing your limits. Knowing
Is it just
your
an
limits.
annoyance or a determining factor as to how long you can keep this up?
Exactly. But if it's not something where it's a deal breaker, then it's really about, okay, let's switch gears and like let's talk about what I actually appreciate about this person. Like what are some things that I really value in this person? Because I think that it's easy for us to just try to pick at the faults, and then it becomes a bigger thing. And then it's a stubbornness of like, why won't you change? But just see how your relationship transforms if every day you just did this experiment with yourself for 7 days where you just like slip in something that you really appreciate about the person. You actually acknowledge them for it.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a great exercise.
Yeah. And then it's so crazy because like you're not telling them that you're doing that. You're just going to do it for a week and see how the dynamic changes.
So it's like, this thing really drives me nuts. Immediately think of this thing that makes me love them even more. Like I love this quality about them. So kind of just run that parallel.
Exactly. Yeah. Radical acceptance sometimes is about what I call like act as if. It's a dialectical behavior therapy term. Basically, it just means like act as if like fill in the blank. Like if you were having a really down day, it's like act as if I wasn't. Act as if I was excited about today. What would I do next? So it's almost that same idea applied to a relationship where like act as if this annoyance is really not what's on my mind. And really it's about, oh my gosh, I'm so appreciative of you for doing this thing. What would I then act like if I really was wanting to appreciate you?
What a great little mindset shift right there.
Yeah,
I love that.
It's a quick one. Yeah.
I want to ask you one more question before I get to my final question.
Okay.
And I think it's one that I think is so important. And maybe before even anyone takes any of what we've talked about in your advice thus far, maybe start here first.
Okay.
I believe this is probably the most important foundation to healthy relationships. And that's the one with ourself. Self-love.
Yep.
Can we truly love and commit to another person if we can't first fully, radically commit to and love ourselves?
It's such a great fundamental question because it's something that I really tackle in the book about, your attachment bonds, all of this past wounds and traumas potentially. At the end of the day, it's about your relationship with yourself and how you think about yourself and how you care and nurture for yourself. And there's lots of people who don't have self-love and are in relationships, obviously. Because,
I think a lot of people,
right?
a lot of people.
A lot of people. So I think it's really about acknowledging that perhaps for you, even if it is a work in progress, that every day you have to know that that self-love has to come from you ultimately and not what your partner does for you. Sometimes people get into relationships and they think, okay, well, they're going to fix me. And like, this is such a strong relationship. Like they're going to fix all my wounds. And it's not fair to put that on one other person.
Self-love does not come from anyone else other than yourself.
Right. It's accepting yourself. It's actually having that acceptance of everything that you are, all your mistakes, all your positive and your not so positive qualities, and knowing that you have value just like anyone else.
Well, this has been so educational, so helpful, so much fun. I would love to get you back in the future because I have so many more questions. My audience have more questions. So where can everybody go before we wrap up to catch more about your book, your work, and everything?
Yeah, so I'm on all the social media platforms, and my handle is at Dr. Judy Ho, and you can learn more about all of my work there. I have lots of free resources. I do lots of giveaways, and you can learn more about my book and my work at drjudyho.com.
Perfect. All linked down in the show notes, video notes for you guys. So this conversation has been geared to help us move forward in our relationship with ourselves and relationship with others. But to move ever forward, when you hear those words, what does that mean to you, Judy, to live a life ever forward?
Well, I love that theme. I love the title of your podcast, and I love just all the guests that you've had on because they all embody that in some way in their own expertise. For me, I think it really means to be a lifelong learner. It's like just never resting on your laurels, and like we're here to learn and absorb and get information. And I just really think that is the most important thing, is that you're just not ever staying stagnant in one place. And there's always something else that you can learn, even in your own area of expertise. But for me, I love exploring all kinds of hobbies, no matter how bad I am at them. Like I tried crochet. It was the worst. I mean, I really overcommitted. I went to Michael's. I bought 50 spools of yarn. I mean, I really overcommitted. And I watched, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 YouTube videos, even watched one for left-handers because I'm a left-handed. And I was like, maybe that's why I'm not a good crochet. I need to, no, I'm just not good at it, but I overcommit. I have all this yarn. So I don't know, hit me up. You guys want some yarn? You guys crochet out there? I mean, it's just sitting collecting dust in a box somewhere in my house. But I love exploring different new things. And so I try to keep learning, even if it's not in my field, and just, finding other new ways for meaningfulness and for joy.
I love that answer. There's never a right or wrong answer. And my kind of takeaway there is that I think that's an area where a lot of us, myself included, we kind of get stuck, but we don't think we're stuck because we think, I'm zoning in on this area. I'm making this area of my life better. I'm, working out more. I'm having better conversations with myself, my partner, my whatever. Insert momentum here. Right. But then we don't fully recognize we're leaving out a lot of other quadrants of our life. Yeah. And so being stagnant doesn't mean not continuously excelling in an area of your choice. Exactly. It means being stagnant by ignoring all the other areas of curiosity, creativity, practicing things that you're not good at. I mean, there's stagnancy in all areas, just not because we're not looking at it.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And like you said, sometimes people zone in on one area, and in some ways it can actually become a form of avoidance coping where they're avoiding issues in the other parts of their life. So I love that. I love that reflection.
Well, Judy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Again, everything's going to be linked down in the show notes and video notes for you guys. This has been so much fun. And one of my favorite things to talk about is relationships. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.